Long ago, in the green rolling hills of Rwanda, there was a kingdom that stood strong and proud.
And a hero,
Amahoro n'uburumbuke ku Rwanda rwacu.
and feared by his enemies.
Tugomba kubaka igihugu gikomera.
Because he carried both wisdom and authority in the way he led his land. During those days, the kingdom was not at peace, because rival groups and enemies were always watching, always waiting for a moment of weakness, and that moment eventually came like a storm that no one could stop. As attackers moved in with force and determination to bring the kingdom down, the attack was sudden and devastating, and the royal palace that once stood as a symbol of strength became a place of fear and chaos, as people ran in all directions trying to save their lives, while the enemy showed no mercy in their mission to destroy everything connected to the king. Image quality 8K Ultra HD African style. The attack was sudden and devastating, and the royal palace that once stood as a symbol of strength became a place of fear and chaos, as people ran in all directions trying to save their lives, while the enemy showed no mercy in their mission to destroy everything connected to the king.
Long ago, in the green rolling hills of Rwanda, there was a kingdom that stood strong and proud.
For Ruganzu, this was not just the loss of a father, but the loss of a world he had barely begun to understand, because in one moment, everything changed. The enemies were not satisfied with killing belonging to uncertainty, because they wanted to erase the royal blood becoming a target. The enemies were not satisfied with killing the king was in grave danger, because they wanted to erase the royal bloodline. And those who were loyal to the family knew that the only way to save him was to get him out before it was in grave danger. And those who were loyal to the family knew that the only way to save him was to get him out before it was too late. The enemies were not satisfied with killing the king alone, because they wanted to erase the royal bloodline completely, which meant that Ruganzu himself was in grave danger. And those who were loyal to the family knew that the only way to save him was to get him out before it was too late. As he was carried away into the unknown, Ruganzu did not fully understand what was happening, but deep inside something began to form. A silent seed of pain, loss, and unanswered questions that would one day grow into something much greater.
The story of Ruganzu Ndoli continued, not in a palace, but in silence and secrecy.
Behind him the kingdom remained broken, leaderless, and controlled by those who had taken it by force, while ahead of him lay a life of exile, struggle, and a journey that would test everything he would become. And so, the story of Ruganzu did not begin with power, but with escape. Because before he could ever become a king, he first had to survive as a boy with nothing, carrying a past he did not choose and a future he could not yet see. He was raised among ordinary people in regions near what is today Kisoro and northern Rwanda, where life was simple and every day was shaped by hard work. The story of Ruganzu and Ndoli continued, and the need to endure whatever came without but in silence and secrecy. And in this new world, as the young boy was no longer treated as people who protected him and was just another child into lands where no one would easily recognize his past and where his true identity allowing him to remain hidden for his own survival, far from the reach of those who had destroyed his family. And although this protected his life, it also meant that Ruganzu grew up without fully knowing who he truly was. As a child, he spent his days herding cattle across the hills, walking long distances under the sun, learning how to survive with little, and slowly becoming familiar with the rhythms of village life, where strength was not as a child but built. He understood the danger that still and where respect was earned, and so they came long distances under the sun, learning how to survive when the world grew far from the reach, and slowly becoming familiar with the rhythms of village. And although sometimes where strength was not given, it also meant that Ruganzu grew up without learning how to survive through actions, and slowly becoming familiar with the rhythms. And though no one spoke directly about his past, was not given, but built something in those stories stirred and where respect was earned through actions rather than as if they were somehow connected to a truth. When the world grew quiet and the fires burned low, he would sometimes sit and listen to the elders speak, hearing stories about kings, battles, and lost kingdoms, and though no one spoke directly about his past, Something in those stories stirred a feeling deep inside him, as if they were somehow connected to a truth he had not yet been told. At night, when the world grew quiet and the fires burned low, he would sometimes sit and listen to the elders speak, hearing stories about kings, battles, and lost kingdoms, and though no one spoke directly about his past, something in those stories stirred a feeling deep inside him, as if they were somehow connected to a truth he had not yet been told.
Long ago,
there were
in the
moments when he
green
felt
rolling
different
hills
from the
of
other
Rwanda,
children.
there was a
Moments when he
kingdom
could
that
not
stood
explain
strong
why
and
certain
proud.
words, certain places, or certain stories made his heart beat faster, as if a hidden memory was trying to rise to the surface, but each time, the answers remained just out of reach. The absence of his parents left a space in his life that could not be filled, and even though he was surrounded by people who cared for him, there was always a quiet loneliness that followed him, a feeling that somewhere beyond the hills he walked each day, there was a life that had been taken from him. As the years passed, Ruganzu began to grow stronger, not just in body, but in mind, as he learned how to observe the world carefully,
in the green
how to listen
rolling
more than he
hills of
spoke,
Rwanda,
and how to
there was a
understand
kingdom
people.
that stood strong
Because
and
living in
proud.
hiding taught him that survival often depended on awareness and patience rather than force. Those who watched him closely began to notice something unusual about him, a natural confidence, a calm strength, and a way of carrying himself that did not match his simple surroundings.
And so,
as
the
if he was
story
meant
of
for something
Ruganzu Ndoli
greater,
continued,
even
not
if
in
no
a
one yet
palace,
spoke it
but in
aloud.
silence and secret.
Still, his life
They
remained
moved
quiet,
carefully
and the
through the
truth about
hills
his
and valleys
past
near
stayed
Kisoro,
hidden,
avoiding crowded
waiting for the right
paths and
moment to
staying
be
away from.
revealed, as Ruganzu continued to live between two worlds, one that he knew, and one that he could only feel deep within himself. And as he slowly moved from childhood toward youth, the questions inside him began to grow louder, because a life built on silence cannot remain silent forever. And the time was coming when Ruganzu would begin to understand who he really was, and why his life had been shaped by loss from the very beginning. That moment of awakening was not far away, and when it came, it would change everything, because the boy who had learned to survive in hiding was about to discover a truth that would set him on a path he could no longer avoid.
amahoro n'uburumbuke ku Rwanda rwacu. Tugomba kubaka igihugu gikomera.
And as the quiet years of hiding began to fade, the life of Ruganzu and Ndoli slowly entered a new phase. One where the silence that had protected him for so long could no longer contain the questions, the feelings, and the growing sense that he was meant for something far beyond the life he was living. Ruganzu was no longer just a boy running across the hills near Kisoro, because his body had grown stronger, his mind sharper, and his presence more noticeable. And those around him began to see that he carried a kind of quiet authority that could not be easily explained. There were moments when he would stand still and look out across the land, his eyes fixed on distant hills, as if he was searching for something he could not yet name. And deep inside him, the feeling that had once been small and unclear had now
Long
become
ago,
stronger,
in the green
heavier,
rolling
and
hills of
impossible to
Rwanda,
ignore.
there was a
And
kingdom
so,
that stood
one
strong
evening,
and proud.
as the sun slowly disappeared behind the hills and the air grew still, the truth was finally spoken to him, not as a story, but as his reality, as he was told about his father, the fallen king, about the attack that destroyed his home, and about the life that had been taken from him before he even had the chance to understand it. In that moment, everything inside Ruganzu changed.
They moved carefully
because
through the
stories
hills and
he had once
valleys near
heard without
Kisoro,
understanding
avoiding
now
crowded
became
paths
personal.
and staying
The
away from.
feelings he could not explain now had meaning, and the emptiness he had carried for so long was suddenly filled with a painful but powerful truth. He was not just a herdsman, not just a survivor, but the son of a king, a rightful heir to a kingdom that had been stolen. And with that knowledge came not comfort, but responsibility, because now he understood that his life was not his alone. At first the weight of this truth was overwhelming, as memories he never lived seemed to press down on him, and the image of a father he barely knew stood before him not as a memory, but as a call to action, a reminder that something had been left unfinished. But Ruganzu did not react with anger or reckless decisions. because the years he had spent in hiding had taught him patience, and instead of rushing forward, he chose to think, to reflect, and to understand what this truth meant for the path ahead of him. As days passed, the fire inside him began to grow, not as wild rage, but as a steady, controlled determination, a deep and unshakable belief that what had been lost could be restored, and that the life he had been forced to live was only the beginning of something much greater. He started to train himself, pushing his body harder, sharpening his thinking, and learning everything he could about leadership, conflict, and the ways of men, because he knew that reclaiming a kingdom would require more than strength. It would require wisdom, strategy, and the ability to inspire others. People around him began to feel the change, even without knowing all the details. As Ruganzu's words carried more weight, his actions more purpose, and his presence more power, as if the hidden truth within him was now shaping everything he did. The boy who once lived without knowing his identity was now becoming a man who fully understood it. And with that understanding came a quiet promise, one he did not need to speak out loud, because it lived within him every single day. He would not remain in hiding forever. He would not allow the past to remain broken. And though he had not yet taken a single step toward reclaiming his kingdom, the decision was already forming inside him, growing stronger with each passing day. Because once a man knows who he truly is, he can no longer live as anything less. And so, the fire within Ruganzu continued to grow, steady and unstoppable, preparing him for the moment when thought would turn into action, and when the life he had been living would finally give way to the destiny that had been waiting for him all along.
And as the fire within Ruganzu and Ndoli continued to grow, there came a moment when thought could no longer remain just thought. Because the truth he had discovered about himself had reached a point where it demanded action. And the life he had been living in quiet preparation could no longer hold him back from what he knew he had to do. Ruganzu understood clearly that reclaiming his kingdom would not be simple, and that the enemies who had destroyed his family were still powerful and alert, which meant that any step he took had to be careful, planned, and guided not by emotion, but by wisdom and patience, because one mistake could cost not only his life, but the hope of restoring everything that had been lost.
For many days and nights he reflected deeply, walking alone across the hills near Kisoro, thinking about the risks, the sacrifices,
Long ago,
and the
in
uncertainty
the green
ahead,
rolling hills of
while also
Rwanda,
feeling the weight
there was
of
a kingdom that
responsibility
stood strong
now
and
rested on
proud.
his shoulders. As the last hope
There was
of a
fear,
fallen
not
kingdom, the kind that weakens a man, but the kind that makes him aware of what is at stake. Because Ruganzu knew that once he began this journey, there would be no turning back, and the life he had known would be left behind completely. But alongside that fear was something stronger, a quiet certainty that his path had already been chosen by the events of his past, and that remaining in hiding would mean abandoning not only his father's legacy, but also the truth of who he had become. And so, the moment came when Ruganzu made his decision, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a calm and steady resolve within his heart, as he accepted fully that he would return to Rwanda, face whatever stood before him, and fight to reclaim what was rightfully his. Once that decision was made, everything about him changed, because he was no longer preparing in uncertainty, but moving forward with purpose, and every action he took now had direction and meaning tied to a clear goal. He began to seek out people he could trust, not by simply revealing who he was, but by observing their character, their loyalty, and their strength. Because he understood that reclaiming a kingdom could never
Long
be done
ago,
alone,
in the green
and that
rolling
the people
hills
he
of
chose to stand
Rwanda,
beside him
there was a
would
kingdom
determine
that
the
stood
success
strong
or
and
failure
proud.
of everything ahead. Slowly, he gathered a small group of loyal companions, men who believed in him not just because of his royal blood, but because of the person he had shown himself to be over the years, as someone disciplined, thoughtful, and strong in both mind and spirit. To them he began to reveal his truth, sharing the story of his past, the fall of his father, and the purpose that now drove him forward. And though the path he offered was filled with danger, they chose to stand with him, not out of obligation, but out of belief. Together they began to prepare in earnest, training harder, planning carefully, and learning everything they could about the current state of Rwanda, including the strengths and weaknesses of those who now held power. Because Ruganzu knew that courage alone would not be enough to win what lay ahead. And yet, despite the quiet nature of these preparations, something powerful was taking shape. Because a man who had once been a hidden child was now becoming a leader with a clear
amahoro
purpose,
n'uburumbuke ku
surrounded by
Rwanda
those who were
rwacu.
willing to risk everything to follow him.
Tugomba
The
kubaka
hills that had
igihugu
once been a
gikomera.
place of hiding were now a place of preparation, and the life he had lived there was slowly coming to an end, as each passing day brought him closer to the moment when he would leave it all behind and step fully into the path that had been waiting for him. And so, with his decision made, his allies gathered, and his mind focused. Ruganzu stood at the edge of a new chapter, knowing that the journey ahead would test him in ways he had never experienced before, but also knowing that he was no longer the boy who had fled in fear. He was now a man with a mission, and the time to act had finally come. And so, with his decision made and his small group of loyal companions ready, Ruganzu and Ndoli began the journey that would take him back toward the land he had lost, a journey not only across distance, but across time, memory, and identity, because every step forward carried him closer to the life that had been taken from him as a child. They moved carefully through the hills and valleys near Kisoro, avoiding crowded paths and staying away from places where their presence might raise suspicion, because Ruganzu understood that the strength of this journey depended not on speed, but on silence and awareness. The land around
Long
them
ago,
was both
in
familiar
the
and
green,
distant,
rolling hills
as
of
if it held
Rwanda,
pieces of a
there was a
past
kingdom that
Ruganzu
stood
could
strong
feel
and
but
proud.
not fully remember. And with every step he took, there was a growing sense that he was moving not just toward a place, but toward a truth that had been waiting for him for many years. The journey was not easy, because the path ahead was filled with uncertainty, and the danger of being discovered was always present, as enemies who once destroyed his family might still be watching, still holding power, and still ready to act if they sensed his return. At times, they walked under the burning sun, their bodies growing tired as they crossed long stretches of land, and at other times they moved through cold nights, guided only by the quiet determination that lived within them, because turning back was no longer an option. There were moments when doubt tried to enter the minds of those who followed him, moments when the weight of what they were attempting felt too great, but Ruganzu remained steady, speaking with calm confidence, reminding them not of fear, but of purpose, and it was this quiet strength that kept them moving forward. As they traveled, Ruganzu listened more than he spoke, gathering information from the people they encountered along the way, learning about the current state of Rwanda, about who held power, and about how the people were living, because he knew that understanding the land was just as important as reaching it. What he heard was not encouraging, as many spoke of a kingdom that had lost its unity, a land
And
where
so,
leadership was weak
the story
and
of
trust
Ruganzu
was
Ndoli
broken.
continued,
And this
not in a
only
palace,
strengthened his
but
resolve,
in silence
because
and
it
secrecy.
confirmed that his return was not just about reclaiming a throne, but about restoring something that had been deeply damaged.
There were quiet moments during the journey when he walked slightly ahead of the others, his thoughts deep and focused, as he imagined what lay ahead. Not in detailed feeling, because he knew that the reality of his return would be far more complex than anything he could fully prepare for.
He was no longer the boy who had been carried away in fear, and yet the memory of that moment still lived within him, now transformed into something stronger, something that pushed him forward instead of holding him back. Each step he took was a step closer to confrontation, to challenge, and to the unknown, but it was also a step closer to reclaiming his identity, his purpose, and the legacy that had been left unfinished. His companions began to see more clearly what kind of leader he was becoming, not one driven by pride or anger, but one guided by patience, awareness, and an unshakable sense of direction. And this gave them confidence even as the risks grew greater. And as the journey continued, the distance between Ruganzu and his homeland grew smaller, while the weight of what awaited him grew larger, until the moment finally began to approach when movement would turn into action. and preparation would give way to confrontation.
The land of Rwanda was no longer just a memory or a story, because it was now within reach. Waiting for the return of a man who had left it as a child and was coming back not in fear, but with purpose.
Journey back home, and so, with his decision made and his small group of loyal companions ready, Ruganzu and Ndoli began the journey that would take him back toward the land he had lost. A journey not only across distance,
And so,
but across
the story
time,
of Ruganzu
memory,
Ndoli
and
continued,
identity.
not in a palace,
Because every
but in
step forward
silence and
carried him
secret.
closer to the life that had been
Long
taken
ago,
from him as a child.
in the green
They
rolling
moved
hills of
carefully through the
Rwanda,
hills and
there was a
valleys
kingdom
near
that stood
Kisoro,
strong and
avoiding
proud.
crowded paths and staying away from places where their presence might raise suspicion. Because Ruganzu understood that the strength of this journey depended not on speed, but on silence and awareness. The land around them was both familiar and distant, as if it held pieces of a past that Ruganzu could feel but not fully remember. And with every step he took, there was a growing sense that he was moving not just toward a place, but toward a truth that had been waiting for him for many years.
The journey was not easy, because the path ahead was filled with uncertainty. And the danger of being discovered was always present, as enemies who once destroyed his family might still be watching, still holding power and still ready to act if they sensed his return.
At times, they walked under the burning sun, their bodies growing tired as they crossed long stretches of land, and at other times they moved through cold nights, guided only by the quiet determination that lived within them, because turning back was no longer an option.
There were moments when doubt tried to enter the minds of those who followed him. Moments when the weight of what they were attempting felt too great. But Ruganzu remained steady, speaking with calm
amahoro n'uburumbuke
confidence,
ku Rwanda rwacu.
reminding them not of fear, but of
Tugomba kubaka
purpose.
igihugu
And it
gikomeye.
was this quiet strength that kept them moving forward.
As they traveled, Ruganzu listened more than he spoke, gathering information from the people they encountered along the way, learning about the current state of Rwanda, about who held power, and about how the people were living, because he knew that understanding the land was just as important as reaching it. What he heard was not encouraging, as many spoke of a kingdom that had lost its unity, a land where leadership was weak and trust was broken. And this only strengthened his resolve, because it confirmed that his return was not just about reclaiming a throne, but about restoring something that had been deeply damaged. The closer they came to Rwanda, the heavier the air seemed to feel, as if the land itself carried the memory of what had happened. And Ruganzu could sense that he was nearing the place where his past and his future would finally meet. There were quiet moments during the journey when he walked slightly ahead of the others, his thoughts deep and focused as he imagined what lay ahead, not in detail, but in feeling, because he knew that the reality of his return would be far more complex than anything he could fully prepare for. He was no longer the boy who had been carried away in fear, and yet the memory of that moment still lived within him, now transformed into something stronger, something that pushed him forward instead of holding him back. Each step he took was a step closer to confrontation, to challenge, and to the unknown, but it was also a step closer to reclaiming his identity, his purpose, and the legacy that had been left unfinished. His companions began to see more clearly what kind of leader he was becoming, not one driven by pride or anger, but one guided by patience, awareness, and an unshakable sense of direction. And this gave them confidence even as the risks grew greater. And as the
Amahoro
journey
n'uburumbuke
continued,
ku
the
Rwanda
distance
rwacu.
between Ruganzu and his homeland grew smaller,
Tugomba kubaka
while the
igihugu
weight of what
gikomeye.
awaited him grew larger, until the moment finally began to approach when movement would turn into action, and preparation would give way to confrontation. The land of Rwanda was no longer just a memory or a story, because it was now within reach, waiting for the return of a man who had left it as a child and was coming back not in fear, but with purpose. And as Ruganzu stepped forward into the next phase of his journey, he knew that what lay ahead would test everything he had learned, everything he had become, and everything he believed in. Because returning home was only the beginning.
The real challenge was about to begin.
And as this slowly gave way to victory, Ruganzu Ndoli found himself standing at the edge of the moment he had been moving toward for so many years. A moment where the battles that had tested him, the losses that had shaped him, and the determination that had carried him forward would finally come together in a single turning point. The resistance that once stood strong against him had begun to weaken as many of his enemies were defeated, while others, seeing the shift in power, chose to step aside rather than continue a fight they could no longer win. And this created a path that led directly to the heart of the
And
kingdom
so,
he had
the
come
story
to
of
reclaim.
Ruganzu
But
Ndoli
even in this
continued,
moment,
not in a
Ruganzu
palace,
did not rush
but in
forward with
silence
pride
and
or
secrecy.
celebration, because he understood that reclaiming a throne was not the same as restoring a kingdom, and that what mattered most was not the act of taking power, but what would follow after it. As he entered the central seat of power, the place that had once belonged to his father, there was a silence that filled the air. Not empty, but heavy with memory. Because this was the place where everything had been lost, and now it was the place where everything would begin again. Those who had followed him stood nearby, not cheering loudly, but watching with deep respect. Because they understood the weight of what this moment meant, not just for Ruganzu, but for the entire land that had lived through years of uncertainty and division. Ruganzu himself stood still for a moment, taking in the reality before him. As the journey from a hidden child to a returning leader reached its most visible point, and though he had imagined this moment many times, the truth of it felt deeper and more complex than any vision he had carried in his mind. He was no longer just a man fighting for a cause. He was now the one responsible for what came next. When he finally accepted the throne, it was not with arrogance, but with a calm and steady presence, as someone who understood that leadership was not about control, but about responsibility, and that the people who now looked to him were not expecting perfection, but direction.
When he finally accepted the throne, it was not with arrogance, but with a calm and steady presence, as someone who
And so,
understood that
the story of
leadership was
Ruganzu
not
Ndoli
about
continued,
control,
not in a
but
palace,
about
but in silence
responsibility,
and secrecy.
and that the people who now looked to him were not expecting perfection, but direction.
The news of his return as king spread quickly across the land, reaching villages, hills, and communities that had long waited for stability. And with that news came a mixture of relief, hope, and cautious belief. As people began to wonder if this truly marked the beginning of a new chapter, many came forward to see him, to hear him, and to understand what kind of leader he would be, and what they found was not a man lost in power, but one grounded by experience, shaped by hardship, and guided by a clear sense of purpose. Ruganzu did not speak of revenge or past anger, because he knew that holding on to such things would only repeat the cycle that had already caused so much loss. And instead, he spoke of unity, of rebuilding, and of creating a future that was stronger than the past that had been broken. This choice set him apart, because it showed that he was not simply reclaiming what was his, but transforming it into something better, something that could bring people together rather than divide them again. And yet, even in this moment of achievement, Ruganzu did not forget where he had come from, because the memories of exile, struggle, and loss remained a part of him, shaping the way he saw the world and the way he chose to lead within it. The throne he now held was not just a symbol of power, but a reminder of everything that had been taken and everything that had been restored. And this understanding gave his leadership a depth that could not be easily shaken. And so, the man who had once been forced to flee in silence had now returned not only as a king, but as a leader who had earned his place through experience, patience, and unshakable determination. The kingdom had its ruler once again, but the true work of leadership was only just beginning. And as the long struggle reached its turning point, Ruganzu Ndoli found himself stepping into the place that had once been taken from him. Not as the frightened child who had been carried away in silence, but as a man who had walked through hardship,
Long ago,
loss,
in the green
and
rolling
relentless
hills
effort
of
to stand
Rwanda,
where he now stood.
there was a kingdom that
And
stood
as the
strong
long struggle
and proud.
reached its turning point, Ruganzu Ndoli found himself stepping into the place that had once been taken from him. Not as the frightened child who had been carried away in silence, but as a man who had walked through hardship, loss, and relentless effort to stand where he now stood. The final resistance against him had faded, not in a single moment, but through many small shifts, as those who once opposed him lost their strength, their support, and their certainty. While Ruganzu's presence continued to grow stronger, supported by people who had come to believe in what he represented. When he finally entered the heart of the kingdom, there was no loud celebration at first, because the moment carried too much weight for noise. As the land itself seemed to pause, holding the memory of what had been lost and the reality of what was now being restored. The place before him was not just a seat of power, but a space filled with the past, where his father had once stood, where the fall of the kingdom had begun, and where everything had changed, and now, standing there, Ruganzu could feel the full circle of his journey in a way that words could not fully express. Those who had followed him watched in silence because they knew that this moment belonged to him. A moment that had been built through years of struggle, patience, and determination. And they understood that what he did next would define not only his leadership, but the future of the entire kingdom. When Ruganzu finally accepted his place as king, it was done with a calm and steady presence, not with pride or display, but with a deep understanding of what leadership truly meant, as something that required strength, wisdom, and a willingness to carry the weight of others. The news of his return spread across the hills and valleys, reaching people who had lived through uncertainty for so long. And as they heard that a rightful leader had returned, many began to feel something they had not felt in years, which was hope. People came from different places to see him, to hear him speak, and to understand who he had become. And what they found was not a man consumed by power, but someone shaped by experience, grounded in reality, and focused on building something that would last. Ruganzu chose his words carefully, speaking not of revenge or past pain, but of unity, restoration, and a shared future. Because he knew that holding on to anger would only continue the cycle that had
amahoro
already caused so
n'uburumbuke ku
much
Rwanda
destruction.
rwacu.
This choice made a deep impact because
Tugomba
it showed
kubaka
that his
igihugu
leadership
gikomera.
was not driven by emotion alone, but by a clear vision of what the kingdom needed in order to heal and grow stronger. Even those who had once stood against him began to see that he was not there to destroy, but to rebuild, and this shifted the way people saw him, from a challenger to a true leader. And yet, even in this moment of success, Ruganzu did not forget the path that had brought him here, because the memory of exile, the lessons of survival, and the experience of struggle remained with him, guiding the way he thought and the way he led. The throne he now held was not just a position, but a symbol of everything he had endured and everything he had restored, and this gave his leadership a depth that could not be easily shaken by challenges ahead. And so, the boy who once fled in fear had now returned as a king, not because he was born into power, but because he had earned it through every step of his journey, and every challenge he had faced along the way. The kingdom once again had a leader, and for the first time in many years, its future began to feel possible again. And as the crown settled firmly on the head of Ruganzu and Ndoli, the reality of leadership began to unfold in ways that were far more demanding than the battles he had already fought. Because winning a kingdom had been difficult, but rebuilding it would require something deeper, something more patient, and something that could not be achieved through force alone. The land he now ruled was still carrying the wounds of the past. As trust between communities had been broken, leadership had been uncertain, and many people had learned to live in fear rather than in unity, which meant that Ruganzu was not stepping into a strong kingdom, but into one that needed to be carefully restored from the inside out. He traveled across the land listening more than he spoke, giving people the space to share their concerns, their experiences, and their hopes, because he knew that a kingdom could not be rebuilt without understanding the lives of those who lived within it. In every village, every gathering, and every quiet conversation, Ruganzu showed a kind of leadership that people had not seen in a long time, one that was grounded in patience, respect, and a genuine desire to bring people back together after years of division. He began to restore systems of order, ensuring that leadership at every level was built on trust and responsibility rather than fear. And slowly, the structure of the kingdom started to take shape again. Not as it once was, but as something stronger and more balanced. He began to restore systems of order, ensuring that leadership at every level was built on trust and responsibility rather than fear. And slowly, the structure of the kingdom started to take shape again. Not as it once was, but as something stronger and more balanced. There were still challenges because not everyone was ready to trust again, and some still held on to old fears and doubts, but Ruganzu did not force change, because he knew that true unity could not be demanded. It had to be built over time through consistent actions and clear intentions. He encouraged cooperation between communities, helping them see that their strength was greater together than apart. And this began to shift the way people related to one another, as the divisions of the past slowly gave way to a shared sense of purpose. Agriculture, trade, and daily life began to stabilize, as people felt more secure in their surroundings. And this created a sense of progress that could be seen not just in leadership, but in the everyday lives of the people, as the kingdom slowly returned to a state of balance. Ruganzu also surrounded himself with advisors who were chosen not only for their loyalty, but for their wisdom and understanding, because he knew that leadership was not about standing alone, but about building a strong foundation of people who could help guide the kingdom forward. The lessons he had learned during his years in hiding became some of his greatest strengths because they allowed him to lead with empathy, to understand the importance of patience, and to recognize that lasting change does not happen quickly, but grows steadily over time. As the months passed, the kingdom began to transform, not in a sudden or dramatic way, but through small, consistent improvements that built trust, restored confidence, and gave people a reason to believe in the future once again. What Ruganzu was building was not just a restored kingdom, but a renewed sense of identity for the people, a reminder that even after deep loss, it is possible to rise again, stronger and more united than before. And through all of this, he remained grounded, never forgetting where he had come from, never losing sight of why he had returned, and never allowing power to distance him from the people he served. The broken land was slowly healing. The kingdom was finding its strength again. And Ruganzu, once a boy in hiding, was now proving that true leadership is not measured by how power is gained, but by how it is used to rebuild what was once lost. And as the kingdom continued to regain its strength under the steady leadership of Ruganzu Ndoli, something else began to grow beyond the borders of the land he ruled. Because his story, his actions, and the way he had risen from loss were no longer known only within Rwanda, but were now being carried across hills, valleys, and communities far beyond. In those days, borders were not like they are today, and people moved, traded, and shared stories freely across regions, which meant that news of Ruganzu's journey traveled naturally into nearby areas, including the lands around Kisoro, where communities already shared deep cultural and historical ties with Rwanda. In those days, borders were not like they are today, and people moved, traded, and shared stories freely across regions, which meant that news of Ruganzu's journey traveled naturally into nearby areas, including the lands around Kisoro, where communities already shared deep cultural and historical ties with Rwanda. Travelers, traders, and elders began to speak of a man who had once lived in hiding and had returned to rebuild a broken kingdom. And these stories were told not just as news, but as lessons, as examples of what determination, patience, and purpose could achieve, even after great loss. Among the people who heard these stories were those whose families had long-standing connections across the region, and for them, Ruganzu was not seen as a distant ruler from another land, but as part of a shared history, someone whose journey reflected the experiences and values they understood deeply. Among the people who heard these stories were those whose families had long-standing connections across the region, and for them, Ruganzu was not seen as a distant ruler from another land, but as part of a shared history, someone whose journey reflected the experiences and values they understood deeply. As his name spread, it began to carry meaning beyond leadership alone, because Ruganzu came to represent resilience. The idea that even when everything is taken away, it is still possible to rebuild, to return, and to restore what once seemed lost forever. In villages far from the center of his kingdom, elders would sit with younger generations and tell the story of his life, describing how he grew from a hidden child into a leader who brought unity back to his people. And these stories were passed down not as distant history, but as something alive, something that still mattered.
The connection between Rwanda
They moved
and
carefully
regions like
through the hills
Kisoro
and valleys near
became even
Kisoro,
more meaningful
avoiding
through these
crowded
shared
paths
stories.
and staying away from
As people recognize the similarities in their cultures, their struggles, and their hopes. And Ruganzu's journey became a symbol that connected them across distance. His influence was not spread through force or command, but through respect and inspiration, because people chose to remember him, to speak of him, and to learn from his example. And this gave his legacy a strength that went beyond the limits of any one kingdom. Even those who had never seen him or lived under his rule began to feel the impact of his story, as it shaped the way people thought about leadership, about resilience, and about what it means to rise after hardship. And as time continued to move forward, Ruganzu's name became more than just the name of a king, because it carried a story, a message, and a sense of identity that people across the region could relate to and carry
Long ago,
with them
in the
their
green
own
rolling
lives.
hills of Rwanda,
The hills
there was a
that
kingdom
once
that stood
separated
strong
communities
and proud.
now felt connected through shared memory. And the story of one man had become part of a wider understanding that strength is not only
Long
found
ago,
in power,
in the green rolling
but in the
hills of
ability to
Rwanda,
endure,
there was a
to
kingdom that
rebuild,
stood strong
and to
and
lead
proud.
with purpose. Ruganzu himself remained focused on his kingdom, continuing the work of rebuilding and strengthening what he had restored. But beyond his direct actions, something larger was taking shape, as his journey became part of a collective memory that would not easily fade.
And so, while the kingdom stood stronger within, his name traveled further beyond, carried by voices, stories, and generations who found meaning in what he had done, and who continued to pass that meaning forward. His influence had crossed the land, his story had reached new ears.
And his legacy was no longer limited to where he ruled, but lived on wherever his story was told and remembered. And as peace and stability continued to grow under the leadership of Ruganzu and Ndoli, his story began to move far beyond the hills of Rwanda, carried not by soldiers or messengers of power, but by ordinary people whose voices turned his life into something larger than a single kingdom. In those times, movement between regions was natural, as traders, families, and travelers passed through lands that today include Kisoro. And with them traveled stories, not written in books, but spoken from memory, shaped by emotion, and shared around fires, in markets, and along long journeys. These stories spoke of a man who had lost everything as a child and yet returned not with bitterness, but with purpose.
And
this
so,
alone
the
made
story
people
of
listen
Ruganzu
closely,
Ndoli continued, not in a
because it
palace,
reflected
but in
a truth
silence
that
and secrecy.
many understood in their own lives: the struggle to rise again after hardship. These stories spoke of a man who had lost everything as a child and yet returned not with bitterness, but with purpose, and this alone made people listen closely, because it reflected a truth that many understood in their own lives: the struggle to rise again after hardship. In the communities around Kisoro, where cultural ties with Rwanda had long existed, his name felt familiar, not foreign, because people there saw parts of their own identity reflected in his story. And this created a strong sense of connection that went beyond geography. Elders in these regions would gather the younger ones and speak about Ruganzu, not only as a king, but as an example
amahoro
of
n'uburumbuke
resilience,
ku Rwanda rwacu.
explaining how he had endured exile,
Tugomba kubaka
learned
igihugu
from
gikomera.
hardship, and returned to rebuild
Long
what others
ago,
believed
in the
could
green
never
rolling
be
hills
restored.
of Rwanda, There was
These
a kingdom
teachings
that
were
stood
not
strong
given as
and proud.
commands, but as guidance, showing that leadership is not about where someone begins, but about how they respond to the challenges they face and how they choose to move forward even when the path is uncertain. As more people heard his story, it began to shape the way they thought about strength, not as something loud or forceful, but as something steady, patient, and deeply rooted in purpose, just as Ruganzu had shown through his actions. Even in places far from the center of his kingdom, his name began to carry respect because it represented something that people valued deeply: the ability to endure loss without losing direction and to rebuild without forgetting the lessons of the past. And so, without ever leaving his land again. Ruganzu's presence could be felt across regions, as if his journey had created a bridge between communities, connecting them through shared understanding and shared stories. His legacy continued
Long
to
ago,
grow in quiet
in the
ways,
green rolling
not
hills
through
of
monuments
Rwanda,
or grand
there was a
displays,
kingdom that stood strong
but
and
through
proud.
conversations, teachings, and memories that passed from one generation to the next, keeping his story alive in the hearts of those who heard it.
What had begun as the life of one man had now become something that belonged to many, because people did not just remember Ruganzu. They carried his story with them, using it to make sense of their own struggles and their own hopes. And in this way, his name spread not just across land, but across time, moving forward with each new voice that chose to tell it, ensuring that what he had lived would not be forgotten, but would continue to inspire long after his own journey had come to an end.
His story, his Najbihim, his legacy, was now part of something much greater than himself. Even as the name of Ruganzu Ndoli continued to spread across the region, and even as his kingdom grew stronger under his guidance, there remained something deeper and more personal within him that many people never fully saw, because behind the crown and the leadership, there was still the memory of everything he had endured before becoming a king. Long before he was known as a ruler, he had been a child who lost everything in a single moment, and that memory never completely left him, because it shaped the way he understood life, not as something guaranteed, but as something fragile that must be protected, built, and respected with care. Those who worked closely with him often noticed that he did not speak loudly or demand unnecessary attention, but instead listened carefully, observed deeply, and made decisions only after understanding the full situation, because he had learned through experience that rushing often leads to mistakes that cannot easily be undone. Unlike leaders who were born into comfort,
Long ago,
Ruganzu
in
understood
the green
struggle
rolling
personally,
hills of Rwanda,
and this
there was a
gave him
kingdom that
deeper
stood strong
sense of
and
empathy
proud.
for those who lived under his rule, because he had once lived among them, shared their conditions, and experienced life without privilege or protection. This understanding influenced the way he governed, as he tried to ensure that decisions were not made only from the center of power, but also reflected the realities of the people in different parts of the kingdom, including those in distant regions connected through culture and history, such as areas around Kasoro. Even though he had achieved what many would consider greatness, Ruganzu did not see himself as above others, because he knew that leadership could change, power could shift. And what truly remained important was the impact one leaves behind in the lives of others. There were moments when he felt the weight of responsibility heavily, especially when difficult decisions had to be made. But instead of avoiding them, he faced them with patience and careful thought, because he understood that Leadership is not about avoiding difficulty, but about carrying it with wisdom. Those around him began to see that his strength was not only in what he achieved, but in how he remained steady even when challenges became complex, and how he never allowed success to disconnect him from the reality of the people he served. And yet, despite all his achievements, there was still a quiet part of him that remained shaped by his early life. A part that never forgot the boy who had once been hidden, unsure of his future, and unaware of the destiny that awaited him. And yet, despite all his achievements, there was still a quiet part of him that remained shaped by his early life. A part that never forgot the boy who had once been hidden, unsure of his future, and unaware of the destiny that awaited him. That connection between past and present made Ruganzu a unique kind of leader because he was not separated from his journey, but defined by it, and every decision he made carried the weight of everything he had experienced. And so, the man behind the crown
Amahoro
was not
n'uburumbuke
separate from
ku
the
Rwanda
king
rwacu.
the world saw, but
Tugomba
deeply
kubaka
connected
igihugu
to him.
gikomera.
Because every strength he displayed in leadership was rooted in the struggles he had overcome before ever taking the throne. His story was not just about ruling a kingdom, it was about carrying a past, shaping a present, and understanding the responsibility of a future that belonged not only to him, but to everyone who looked to him for guidance. His story was not just about ruling a kingdom. It was about carrying
They
a
moved
past,
carefully through the hills and
shaping a
valleys near
present,
Kisoro,
and
avoiding
understanding the
crowded paths and
responsibility
staying
of a
away from
future that belonged not only to him, but to everyone who looked to him for guidance.